So there are so many different types of despair. We get a whole taxonomy of despair in this book. But Kierkegaard says repeatedly that the most important thing that distinguishes different forms of despair is consciousness. He says, beginning of section B on page 72, it is the rising level of consciousness, or the degree to which it rises, that is the continual intensification of despair. The more consciousness, the more intense the despair. So we go back to the beginning and we remind ourselves that for Kierkegaard, to be a self is to be aware of oneself. And apparently, to be aware of oneself, to the degree to which one is aware of oneself, is to be aware that one is in despair. So we can see, again, many things linked together. Being a self, being aware of oneself, and being aware of one's despair, and being in despair. That is, the despair intensifies according to the degree of self-consciousness. So the degree to which you are aware that you are in despair intensifies the despair itself, so that he says at the bottom of page 72 that the maximum despair is the devil's despair. He says the devil is pure spirit. That is, the devil, if we imagine the devil, is entirely aware of himself. There's nothing opaque, there's nothing hidden from himself. So that his despair is at the maximum. That is, he knows his situation, and yet he is still in despair. And his despair, and I think very importantly, is characterized on page 72 as the most absolute defiance. So the way that he distinguishes between different forms of despair in the most fundamental way is the despair that's aware of itself and the despair that is not aware of being in despair. Which is worse? Well, that's a good question. To ask which is worse is a dialectical question. That is, in one sense, it's worse to be in despair and not know it, because then you don't even know you're ill in the spirit, so you don't know that there's anything wrong, so you don't do anything about it. But in another sense, to be in despair and to be aware that one is in despair is far, far worse. It says on the top of page 75, however, it is only in one sense, a purely dialectical sense, that the person ignorant of his despair is further from the truth, and from what will deliver him, than the person who knows it, yet remains in despair. For in another sense, ethico-dialectically, whatever that's supposed to mean, it is the person who remains in despair and is conscious of his despair who is further from deliverance. That, I think, will gradually become clear. That is, this book, again, is a description of a journey of the self in becoming itself. It's not a straight line. And it's not even a zigzag line. It's more like a kind of a curve of a certain sort. That is, that if the goal is to become a self in the fullest sense, and to get out of despair, and if we've gotten a couple of indications that that would mean to want to be oneself, and to be in relation to the power that established you in a transparent way, that is, knowing your true situation, knowing you are in the presence of God, and affirming your true self. If that is the goal, it's reached in a kind of a curve of a certain way, because you can't get there in a straight line. That is, certainly he indicates that to get there, as he says in the bottom of page 74, to arrive at the truth, one has to pass through every negativity. And negativity is when you face a situation in which one thing appears to be the truth. And that truth has to dissolve into has to be negated, has to be denied in order for you to reach a further truth. Let's take a child growing up. A child growing up takes his or her parents as being the ultimate authority for things, and that's natural for a child. That is, mom and dad are the ultimate arbiters of what's right and wrong, what is permissible and impermissible. At a certain point in our development, we have to negate that truth. That is, we have to go beyond it. Not that it was absolutely wrong, but that it was only partial, and it had to be transcended. That is, maybe our own conscience is the ultimate arbiter of what is right and wrong, and then there's the law too. So that would be an example, I would say, of a negativity. To arrive at the truth, Kierkegaard says, the soul has to pass through every sort of negativity till it reaches the end. And that journey, again, is not a straight line. It's more like a curve, and it's a kind of curve where to get to where you're going, you, at least temporarily, have to get farther away from your destination. So that, in a sense, the person who is actually in despair and knows it is farther away from the truth, from the goal, than the person who is not even aware of their despair. And I think, again, that is something that will come up again as we go on. But the form of despair that is not aware of being in despair is actually quite common, not only in the world around Kierkegaard and us, I would imagine, but in history. Because if you really think about him as a Christian, saying that the only way you can really know yourself is to be aware of being in the presence of God. And God here, we can take that word however we want, but for Kierkegaard it definitely means the monotheistic God, that is the familiar God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And of course he's a Christian, so it's a special thing. But so most of the world and most of the people throughout history have not believed such a thing. And that's a problem for somebody like Kierkegaard, who is, of course, a philosopher and so has huge respect for the pagan philosophers. But he characterizes them, on the bottom of page 76, as being in despair. He says, that is what the old church fathers meant when they spoke of pagan virtues as splendid vices. I mean, what could be more splendid, to a philosopher at least, than the philosophies of people like Plato and Aristotle? How could we characterize those thinkers as being in despair? Well, certainly they had to be in despair and not know it, right? To continue, he says, they meant that the heart of paganism was despair, that the pagan was not conscious of himself before God as spirit. And he goes on to say this is why suicide was not a huge deal for the people of the ancient world, because he says on page 77, the pagan lacked the spirit's definition of a self. That is why he judged suicide in such a way. He lacked the God relationship in the self. That is, the pagan thinkers were in despair. Why? Because they weren't selves to the fullest extent, because they didn't realize that their self was in relation to, transcended itself, pointed beyond itself to a relationship with God. And you know, it may seem really silly and frankly kind of arrogant to consign the vast majority of the human race throughout history as being in despair. But I think that from Kierkegaard's Christian point of view, there's really no alternative. I mean, even Dante in the Inferno, he didn't have the heart to stick the Plato and Aristotle and the rest of the great classical thinkers and writers in hell. He put him in this nice field outside of hell, and when he and Virgil go through the gates of hell, I think, as I remember, they meet these guys in a nice grassy field. To Kierkegaard, anybody who is unaware of being a self in the presence of God is by definition in despair, and things really get interesting when one does become aware of that situation, because frankly it's not altogether a happy realization.